Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really important journey into an institution you hear about all the time, the U.S. Supreme Court. Powerful, often debated.
Definitely.
Our mission really is to unpack it for you. What is it? How does it actually work? And maybe most importantly, why do its decisions send these ripples, through millions of lives? Not just in the States, but sometimes globally, too.
That's the key question.
Yeah, so we've got articles, research, notes. We're going to sift through it all, try to pull out the really key bits of knowledge. We're hoping for more than just facts, right? We want those aha moments for you.
Exactly. And fundamentally, the Supreme Court is the top court. It's the highest judicial authority in the U.S. system. It gets the final say on interpreting the Constitution.
The final word. That sounds huge.
It is. It shapes so much of everyday life.
So, okay, let's lay the groundwork then. Beyond the title, what is the Supreme Court at its core? Like, how does it actually function as this bedrock?
Right. Well, it was officially set up by Article 3 of the Constitution way back in 1789.
Wow.
And it sits, physically, in Washington, D.C. Its power isn't just based on tradition. It comes directly from the Constitution and federal laws.
So it's baked right into the system.
Picked right in. And its main job, its foundational role, is to look at laws passed by Congress, actions by the president, and decide if they actually line up with the Constitution.
Checking them, basically.
Exactly. Constitutional check. And, it's worth mentioning, while we're focusing on the U.S. court, lots of countries have similar bodies. Think India's Supreme Court or Germany's Constitutional Court. They do comparable things, making sure laws stick to the highest legal principles of their nations.
That makes sense. So this structural role, it sounds incredibly important. When we talk about its power, what are the actual, jobs or duties that make it so impactful? What does it do?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. The functions are pretty clearly defined, but incredibly powerful. There are basically four main ones.
Okay.
First, and this is probably the most famous one, is judicial review.
Right, I've heard that term.
So this power wasn't actually spelled out word for word in the Constitution. It was established later in a landmark case called Marbury v. Madison. That was 1803.
Oh.
And it allows the court to strike down laws or actions by the executive branch if they decide they're unconstitutional.
Strike them down, just like that.
Well, yeah. Think about it. They can basically say, nope, this law passed by Congress or this order from the president doesn't square with the Constitution. It's a huge check on the other branches.
That power seems immense, almost absolute.
Mm-hmm.
Are there checks on that power, or is the court really the final word?
That's a good question.
Mm.
Their decisions are final for a specific case, yes. But the power isn't totally unlimited. They can only rule on cases that are actually brought to them. They don't just, wake up and decide to review a law.
Oh, okay. It has to come through the system.
Exactly. And theoretically, at least, the Constitution itself can be amended to overturn one of their interpretations. But that's pretty rare and very difficult.
Gotcha. Okay, so judicial review is number one. What else?
Okay. Second is constitutional interpretation. They're constantly figuring out what the Constitution means and how it applies today. To real-world situations, things the founders maybe couldn't have even imagined.
Like applying 18th century text to the internet age sort of thing.
Precisely, that kind of thing. Third, they resolve disputes. Now, this includes cases where they have original jurisdiction, meaning the case starts right there, like disputes between two states.
Oh, like over borders or water rights?
Exactly, or disputes between branches of the federal government. They also hear appeals from lower federal courts when there's a really important constitutional question involved.
Okay. And the fourth?
The fourth is setting precedents. This is crucial. Every time they make a ruling, that decision becomes a binding precedent.
Binding?
Meaning all other courts in the U.S., federal and state, have to follow that interpretation of the law from then on. And these precedents, they often end up influencing legal thinking in other countries, too.
So their decisions ripple outwards, setting the rules for everyone else.
That's it. It creates a uniform understanding of the law across the country.
It's really clear how these functions give the court just enormous power. But thinking about that power, especially interpreting the Constitution for future generations, does that create a unique kind of challenge for a democracy?
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical point. Because their interpretations become the law, effectively, they shape our legal and social landscape for, decades, sometimes longer.
Wow.
The challenge is exactly that. You have an unelected body interpreting a foundational document, trying to balance, maybe the original intent with today's values and realities.
Without a direct vote from the people.
Exactly. What the court says today can fundamentally change rights and responsibilities for generations, all without the public directly weighing in through an election on that specific issue. It's a real tension.
Okay, so we've seen the incredible scope of what the court does. Who are the people actually making these huge decisions? Who are the justices, and how do they get these jobs for life?
Right. So the court has 9 members. There's one Chief Justice who kind of leads the court administratively, and then 8 associate justices.
9 in total.
9 total. And getting there, well, it's a 2-step process. First, the President of the United States nominates someone,
Any president.
the sitting president, whenever there's a vacancy. Then that nomination goes to the Senate for a confirmation process. Hearings, debates, and finally, a vote.
Need Senate approval.
Need Senate approval, a majority vote, and once they're confirmed, they have life tenure.
Life tenure, that's the big one.
Yeah, it means they serve until they choose to retire or resign, or they pass away, or, and this is super rare, they get impeached and removed by Congress.
Has that ever happened? Impeachment.
One justice was impeached by the House back in the 1800s, Samuel Chase, but he was acquitted by the Senate. So no justice has ever actually been removed through impeachment.
Wow. So effectively, it's a job for life.
Yeah.
Why? What's the thinking behind that?
The idea, the original intent was to insulate them, to protect them from the sort of day-to-day political pressures.
Like elections and public opinion swings.
Exactly. The hope was that life tenure would ensure judicial independence, allow them to make decisions based purely on the law and the Constitution, not worrying about pleasing voters or political parties.
That's the ideal, keeping them impartial. But, you hear so much criticism today about the court being politicized, especially during those confirmation battles. How do we square that ideal with, well, the reality we sometimes see?
That is precisely the tension, isn't it? The goal is independence, but the process itself, presidential nomination, Senate confirmation, is inherently political.
Right. Presidents pick people they think align with their views.
Often, yes. They look at a nominee's judicial philosophy, their past rulings or writings, and this leads to these really intense, often partisan fights during the confirmation hearings in the Senate.
So the politics gets baked in right at the start.
It can feel that way. Once they're on the bench, they are supposed to be apolitical umpires just calling balls and strikes, as Chief Justice Roberts famously put it. But their past views, the very questions asked during confirmation, can sometimes give clues about how they might rule. It definitely blurs that line for the public.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so they serve for life. How does a case even get to the Supreme Court? You said they don't hear everything. Their workload must be massive, but they're selective.
Incredibly selective. Yeah. They don't hear everything, not even close. First, you got to understand the basic federal court structure. It's like a pyramid.
Okay.
At the bottom, you have the U.S. district courts. These are the main trial courts. Evidence is presented. Juries might decide facts.
Where most federal cases start.
Exactly. Then, if a party isn't happy with the outcome, they can appeal to the next level up, the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals.
The intermediate level.
Right. There are 13 of these circuit courts. They review the trial court's decision for errors of law. And then, at the very top of the pyramid, is the Supreme Court.
The final stop.
The final appellate court. And here's the key. They have almost complete control, what's called discretion, over which cases they actually decide to hear.
So they get to pick and choose.
Pretty much. They get thousands of petitions every year, something like 7,000 to 8,000 requests, asking them to review a lower court decision.
7,000 or 8,000. Wow. How many do they actually take?
Usually only about 70 to 80, sometimes even fewer.
70 out of 7,000. That's tiny. A really small fraction.
It really is, like 1%.
So what's the magic formula? How does a case make that tiny cut?
Well, most cases get to the court through something called a writ of certiorari, fancy Latin, but it's basically just a formal request, a petition, asking the court to review the decision of a lower court.
A cert petition.
Right. And for the court to actually agree to hear the case, to grant, at least 4 of the 9 justices have to vote yes.
Ah, the rule of 4.
That's the one, the rule of 4. They don't need a majority to take the case, just 4 justices.
What are those 4 justices looking for? Why say yes to one case out of 100?
They're typically looking for a few things. Does the case involve a really significant constitutional question? Is there a split among the lower federal courts? Like, different circuit courts have ruled differently on the same legal issue?
So they need to create a single national rule.
Exactly. Resolve those conflicts. Or does the case address an issue of major national importance? It has to be something significant, usually with broad implications beyond just the parties involved.
Okay, so it gets granted cert. Then what happens?
Then the process really kicks into gear. Lawyers for each side submit detailed written arguments called briefs, and then comes oral argument.
That's where they argue in front of the justices.
Yep. Usually each side gets about 30 minutes. And the justices, they don't just sit there quietly. They jump in, interrupt, ask really tough questions. It can be pretty intense.
I bet. Trying to poke holes in the arguments.
Or clarify points, test the boundaries of the lawyer's reasoning. After oral arguments, the justices meet privately in what's called a conference. Just them.
No one else allowed.
No one else. They discuss the case, debate the issues, and take an initial vote.
Okay.
Then, if there's a majority, 5 or more justices agreeing on the outcome, the Chief Justice, if they're in the majority or the most senior justice in the majority, assigns one justice to write the official explanation. The majority opinion.
The one that sets the precedent.
That's the one.
Yeah.
That opinion explains the court's reasoning and becomes the binding law. But other justices might write too. If a justice agrees with the outcome, but for different reasons, they might write a concurring opinion.
Right.
And if justices disagree with the majority outcome entirely, they can write dissenting opinions explaining why they think the majority is wrong.
So you can see the disagreement right there in the decision.
Absolutely. And those dissents can sometimes be really powerful, maybe even influencing future courts down the line.
Okay, to really get a feel for the court's impact, its ripple effect, maybe we should look at some specific moments. Cases where the court's decision literally changed the country, those real turning points.
Yeah, looking at landmark cases is probably the best way to see the court's power in action, how it shapes the nation. We already mentioned one pivotal case, Marbury v. Madison, back in 1803.
Right, the judicial review one.
Exactly. Sounds old and dusty, maybe, but it was absolutely monumental. It established that the court could strike down laws. It really solidified the court's place as a co-equal branch of government, the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. Huge.
Set the stage for everything else.
Pretty much. Then, fast forward quite a bit to 1954. You have Brown v. Board of Education.
A name most people recognize.
For good reason. This decision declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It famously overturned the older separate but equal doctrine from a case called Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
So it directly reversed a previous Supreme Court ruling.
It did. And Brown wasn't just about schools. It was a massive catalyst for the civil rights movement. It profoundly began to reshape American society, though the implementation took, well, a very long time and a lot of struggle.
It's incredible, yeah, how one ruling, even from decades or centuries ago, still defines things for us today. What about some more recent examples? Pivotal moments may be closer to our own time.
Definitely. Let's jump to 1973, Roe v. Wade.
Another really well-known one.
Extremely. This decision legalized abortion nationwide. It did so by establishing a right to privacy, grounded in the Constitution, that covered a woman's decision about pregnancy. This precedent stood for nearly 50 years.
A cornerstone decision for decades.
Absolutely. Then, moving into the 21st century, in 2015, we got Obergefell v. Hodges.
What was that one about?
That's the case that legalized same-sex marriage across the entire United States. The court found that limiting marriage to opposite-sex couples violated the Constitution's guarantees of due process and equal protection, a major expansion of civil rights.
Right. Huge impact on equality.
Immense. And then, very recently, in 2022, we saw Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization.
And that one.
That decision overturned Roe v. Wade. It fundamentally changed the landscape. The court concluded that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion, returning the authority to regulate or ban abortion to the individual states.
So it undid the nationwide right established by Roe.
Precisely. It shows how the court can establish precedent, interpret it for years, and then eventually even overturn its own prior landmark decisions. The lineup of justices changes over time. Their interpretations can change too.
These decisions really underscore how the court, sometimes in just one ruling, can dramatically alter daily life for millions. Thinking about these cases, especially the more recent ones like Obergefell or Dobbs, what really strikes you about how those rulings played out in society almost immediately?
Well, what's really striking is the immediacy and the often stark nature of the impact. Take Dobbs, for instance. The moment that decision came down, the legal status of abortion access shifted literally overnight for millions of women, depending entirely on which state they lived in. It wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous, creating this complex patchwork of laws.
A very sudden change.
Very sudden, and similarly with Obergefell, it granted immediate legal recognition and all the rights and responsibilities that come with marriage to countless same-sex couples who had been denied them just the day before. These aren't just abstract legal points. They are concrete shifts in people's freedoms, their family structures, their legal protections, and they almost always ignite intense public debate and sometimes significant social realignment.
Yeah, that immediate real-world effect is powerful. Now, if we connect this back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of impartiality versus ideology. We often hear about the court's ideological balance, conservative versus liberal justices. What does that actually mean in practice, and how does it affect these kinds of decisions?
It's a really important and often controversial aspect. While justices, as we said, are appointed for life and are supposed to be impartial umpires, their judicial philosophies, how they approach interpreting the Constitution and laws, often do reflect, to some extent, the general outlook of the presidents who appointed them.
So, a president known for conservative views might appoint justices expected to rule conservatively.
Generally, yes. That's often the expectation. We tend to categorize justices broadly along a spectrum, maybe liberal, moderate, conservative. And as of now, 2025, the prevailing view is that the U.S. Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative majority, based on the presidents who appointed the current justices.
6 conservative, 3 liberal is the common understanding.
That's the common shorthand, yes. And this composition, this balance, can significantly influence how the court decides major cases. Issues like, say, gun rights, environmental regulations, religious freedom claims, voting laws, affirmative action, reproductive rights.
All the big hot-button issues.
Often, yes. A conservative majority might, for example, lean towards interpretations that favor states' rights over federal power, or take a broader view of individual gun rights under the Second Amendment, or perhaps be more skeptical of certain government regulations. A liberal majority might lean the other way, perhaps favoring broader federal authority for certain issues, or interpreting privacy rights more expansively.
So it's not like they're voting purely politically, like legislators.
No, that's not the idea. They're applying legal principles and judicial philosophies. But different philosophies say originalism versus a living constitutionalism approach can lead justices to predictably different conclusions on the same set of facts and laws.
Which can look like ideological alignment from the outside.
Exactly. It leads to this perception, and sometimes the reality, that the court's makeup heavily influences the direction of American law on these major societal questions.
That makes a lot of sense. So thinking globally now, is the U.S. Supreme Court kind of unique in its setup and power? Or do other countries have similar top courts?
It has some unique features, definitely, like the life tenure aspect combined with its strong power of judicial review. But the basic idea of a high court, that's common. Many countries have analogous courts that perform similar functions within their own systems.
Can you give an example or two?
Sure. Take India. Their Supreme Court has a very similar role in many ways. It interprets the Indian Constitution, it can review laws, it protects fundamental rights. One interesting difference, though, is their broader use of something called public interest litigation, or PIL.
What's that?
It basically allows ordinary citizens or groups to bring cases to the court on behalf of the public, even if they aren't directly harmed themselves. It's been a really powerful tool for social justice issues in India.
Interesting. Okay. Anywhere else?
Well, look at the United Kingdom. Their Supreme Court is actually quite new, created only in 2009. Before that, the highest court was technically a committee within the House of Lords.
Oh, wow. Recent change.
Yeah. And the UK Supreme Court tends to focus more on interpreting statutes, the laws passed by Parliament. It doesn't really do constitutional review in the same way as the US court, mainly because the UK doesn't have a single written constitution like the US does. Parliament is considered supreme.
Different system entirely, almost.
Different tradition. And then maybe one more, Germany. They have the Federal Constitutional Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht. It's highly respected and focuses strictly on constitutional matters. It plays a really strong role in protecting human rights guaranteed in their basic law, and also in managing the balance of power between the federal government and the German states, the Länder.
So similar functions, upholding the Constitution, resolving disputes, but adapted to each country's specific history and legal framework.
Exactly. Each system reflects its own national context.
Okay, this leads to a really important question then.
Yeah.
With all this power, the ability to shape society so profoundly, does the Supreme Court face criticism? And maybe tying it all together, what's its relevance right now, today, to you listening?
Oh, it absolutely faces criticism. Especially now, in such a polarized environment, several recurring themes come up.
Like what?
Well, partisanship, as we discussed. The argument that the court has become too political, that decisions sometimes seem to align too closely with the ideology of the appointing president rather than neutral legal principles.
The perception, at least.
Right. Then there's criticism about a lack of transparency. Their deliberations, those conferences where they debate and vote, are completely private. And unlike lower federal judges, the Supreme Court justices aren't currently bound by a formal, enforceable code of ethics specific to them, which raises concerns for some.
Interesting. No binding ethics code.
Not in the same way lower court judges have. They follow ethical principles, but it's not formalized in the same binding structure.
Hey.
And of course, life tenure. That comes up again and again. Critics argue it gives justices too much power for too long, potentially letting them become out of touch. Some people advocate for term limits instead.
So, real criticisms about how it operates.
Definitely. But despite the criticisms, its relevance today is undeniable. You really can't overstate it. The court's decisions directly impact millions and millions of lives.
How so, specifically?
Think about it. Access to healthcare, the rules around voting, religious freedom protections, how businesses are regulated, immigration policy, LGBTQ+ rights, environmental rules, the list goes on and on.
All areas touched by the court.
Absolutely. And we've seen major rulings just in the last couple of years that have significantly reshaped the U.S. legal landscape. For example, the 2023 decision striking down affirmative action in college admissions.
Right, that was huge news.
Huge impact on higher education. Other recent decisions have allowed for expanded gun rights in certain contexts based on interpretations of the Second Amendment. And the court has also issued rulings that curb the power of federal agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Federal Trade Commission, limiting their ability to make broad regulations without very specific authorization from Congress.
So affecting government power, too.
Definitely. Affecting the balance between branches of government and between the federal government and states. These aren't just abstract legal debates. They directly influence your rights, your opportunities, the environment you live in, the regulations businesses follow. It's incredibly relevant.
So pulling this all together,
Yeah.
what's the big takeaway? We've seen the Supreme Court is clearly way more than just another court applying laws. It's something bigger.
That's exactly right. It's really a guardian, you could say, of constitutional values, or at least its interpretation of those values. It's constantly interpreting what American democracy means in practice. And it acts as this incredibly powerful referee in the balance of power between the government and the people, and between different parts of the government itself. Its influence just radiates outwards, shaping the whole fabric of society.
Okay, so whether we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court or similar high courts elsewhere, they really do help define the legal and, you could argue, the moral compass of a nation, which leaves us and you with a pretty compelling thought to chew on.
What does it truly mean for a country, for any country, to have that fundamental legal and moral compass set, in large part by a small group of unelected individuals who often hold their positions for life?
Something to think about.
Yeah.
We really encourage you to continue your own deep dive. Maybe pick one of those landmark cases we mentioned or a constitutional idea that caught your attention and explore it further. Thanks for joining us.